Hi, folks. Okay, this is post-war Japanese cinema and the birth of Godzilla, an examination of the social factors and historical events that led up to the creation of the world's most popular monster.
Godzilla!
Okay, let's start at the beginning and do a quick rundown of pre-war Japanese cinema. Cinema arrived in Japan in the 1890s. There has been cinema in Japan for each of the four modern eras: Meiji, Taisho, Showa, and Heisei. And we're going to get a fifth era coming this year, so we don't know what that's going to be yet. It was kind of primitive. It didn't really take off until after the Meiji era ended and Taisho began. In the early days, it was of course all silent. They had to hire these narrators called benshi to tell you what was going on screen, so they basically narrated the story to you like they were telling a tale with illustrations with the movie as the illustrations. There are two major kinds of film. This is really kind of boiling things down to the basics. There was Gendai Geki, which is film set in the modern day, and Jidai Geki, which were films set in the past. That's where your samurai movies and whatnot came from. I missed something. Okay. This right here is a clip from a movie from 1921 called Jiraiya. It's a ninja film. Starring Jiraiya the ninja who could turn into a toad. This is a common character you will see in a ton of Japanese media. If you ever wondered why in Power Rangers the movie, the Black Ranger goes, "Why am I a frog?" That's why he's a frog, because in the Japanese version, the character was supposed to be the descendant of Jiraiya. Okay, Taisho era comes along. Everything starts to modernize, especially after the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. It basically it literally levels the playing field. They have to build from scratch. Also, the Taisho emperor was fairly sickly and passed a lot of his authority onto a parliament, basically what we call the Diet today. It was a period of incredible democratization in Japan and an embrace of everything Western, including to the fact that things like no theater and kabuki were considered pastiche and sort of niche things that nobody did anymore. Now, this wasn't going to stand with the next administration, the Showa era. The Showa era had a backlash against Western influence majorly. They really wanted to go back to basics as far as, this is Japan, this is what Japan stands for, this is our culture, this is our history. So they started to create kind of a national mythology, sort of like the United States has for the Old West and the Revolutionary War. This glorification of everything that had come before to create the sense of a united nation. They started to stress a lot of common values, like less about individualism and more about the collective good of society. And they started to promote traditional culture again. Unfortunately, cinema was not something they could get rid of. So they started taking traditional stories and putting them more and more into the context of film. They were also really, really late in adopting sound film. Now, a lot of the films from the Taisho era and even from the early Showa era are gone, just missing. That's a combination of war and the fact that film in those days was on nitrate cellulose, which was extremely flammable and combustible, and a lot of that stuff just doesn't even exist. Even a lot of American films from there are just gone. Okay, now we get to the ramp up to the war. The Japanese were really into pushing this narrative of a singular culture. Now, that's not to say that everybody in Japan believed it. It's just, what the propaganda was telling them. And the imperial government, there used to be like 7, 8, 9 studios. the Imperial government was like, well, we're going to consolidate these all down to 2. And the studio that became Toho was like, well, how about we make that 3, and then you'll have more studios to churn out movies for you. And the Japanese government was like, it sounds like a good idea. Okay, you get to be a studio too. And there was heavy censorship. Anything that was considered anti-military, anti-Japanese, anti-traditional values was stomped out. That's why a lot of the early works of filmmakers like Akira Kurosawa were kind of heavily censored, or he was forced to make lackluster sequels to them that were way more nationalistic. The weird thing about Japanese propaganda, though, as opposed to Western propaganda, was it didn't tend to demonize their enemies, it just glorified their own people. Which is really strange, especially what I'm about to show you here. This is the very first full-length animated film made in Japan, Momotaro's Divine Soldiers of the Sea. It was produced by the Japanese Navy, and it was filmed in 44 but not released till 45. This is what that looked like. Come on. These animals all represent the natives of the islands the Japanese have conquered, willingly helping them put together their war machine. Because all the Japanese are also animals. The only humans you ever see in this film are the enemy. And they're all British people with no chins. This film also should not exist. It was on the American occupation forces list of films to be destroyed, but someone hit a copy under the floorboards of a house. Best scenes in that movie, by the way, is there's a scene where the Japanese soldiers are teaching natives how to speak Japanese by giving them the alphabet. And if you know anything about the Japanese alphabet, it's not the same one we use today. It's changed so much in the last 70 plus years. There's letters they don't use anymore. They go through the W's and they go wa wee woo way wo, and we're like, you don't use most of those anymore. What's going on? The best part is that it's an alphabet song. I would play it, but it's 6 minutes long. I will play it later. And the best part, though, is that if you know another thing, if you know about Japanese, there's only one letter in Japanese that does not have a vowel sound. They end it at the very end, and everyone just sings. Now, this one's a much more important film. This is The War at Sea from Hawaii to Melee. It was actually made before. This was a Japanese propaganda film talking about their glorious victories at sea that recreated the Battle of Pearl Harbor in miniature. The guy who did the special effects for this is a man by the name of Eiji Tsuburaya. He's really important, we'll get to him later. This was a hugely budgeted film at the time with a budget of $380,000 US. The standard Japanese film had a budget of maybe $50,000 US at the time. This is from the Battle of Pearl Harbor recreation scene. Mind you, all of this is done in miniature. Can everybody see that okay? Well, okay, some of the plane footage is real planes, but all the explosions and ships, they're all miniatures. Sadly, I couldn't find this one subtitled. Okay, Japanese cinema was going great under the imperial government, and then something happened in August of 1945. There's a lot of reasons behind this, and I'm not going to get into any moral equivalency or anything. It's just 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Japan. This was the first and only time an atomic weapon or a nuclear weapon of any kind has been used in war. Lots of people died. They found out horrible things about radiation sickness. It was one of the worst things that anyone has ever done to anybody. And it also ended the imperial reign. Well, not the entire imperial reign. The emperor was allowed to keep his position. But all of the military government was gone. And the Americans moved in and started setting up a new government, and that's where we get occupation era cinema from. That's still from the movie Ikuru, which they talked about before I got here. Okay, under the American occupation, these aren't hard and fast rules because you can still make these kinds of films. You can still make samurai movies, you can still make Yakuza movies, but they had to be in such a context that it showed them as backwards or negative. Because the American occupation government was obsessed with rooting out feudal culture and making sure the Japanese were modernized and westernized. Many of the wartime filmmakers were blacklisted, including the guy who did the special effects for the war at sea. Eiji Tsuburaya found out suddenly he had no job. He couldn't find work. Nobody wanted to hire him. You couldn't mention the atomic bombings. You couldn't film any bombed out areas. You couldn't film any American troops, which made it really hard if you wanted to film in an area like Tokyo Station, because you'd have to frame it so there were no Americans in shot, or turn off your camera if an American wandered in. You just could not film the occupying forces. Another thing you couldn't film, Mount Fuji. You were not allowed to because it had been used as a propaganda tool during the war. And the Americans were like, no, just no, you can't film it. I don't care what you want to do with it, no, you can't show it. They actually argued over whether or not they could allow people to be filmed bowing, because they considered that to be feudal behavior. And then they realized, wait, if we don't allow people to bow on film, everyone's going to look like a bunch of really incredibly rude assholes to each other. So they left it in. Now, one of the things they did want is they wanted to promote modernity. They wanted to talk about societal problems. They actually started the first unions in Japanese cinemas. So you've got labor relations between the lower ranks and the higher ranks. There were a lot of strikes at this time. All the studios were broken back up again into the multiple studios that we have today, or some of them are dead again now. They promoted democracy through film, they promoted pacifism, they promoted a hopeful future, and they started to promote individualism as opposed to the collective good. This was all great until McCarthyism happened in the United States and the Red Scare started, and they decided, oh wait, unions are bad, we need to do something about that. There was actually a labor strike at Toho in 1949 that was put down by the American occupation forces with tanks and guns. The striking workers went on to form their own breakaway studio called Toho. Toho would become the producer of horror movies in Japan in the 1950s and 60s. They were fantastically creative. And basically it was a bunch of the younger directors and younger producers who were like, we don't like having to wait for the old guys to die for us to get a job, to be allowed to make movies. So we're going over here and making our own movies. Of course, the two big filmmakers at the time were Akira Kurosawa. I don't need to talk about that. We just had a big panel on that one. So, and Yasujiro Ozu. Ozu started making movies before the war, but he almost stopped making them during the war because he couldn't stand the military censorship. Some of his best movies were delayed until after the war was over before he made them. One of the movies he made right after was Record of a Tenement Gentleman, and then he had a trilogy, Late Spring, Early Summer, Tokyo Story, which are, if you have never seen them, these are great films. He has a really unique style. He actually violates a lot of the rules of normal filmmaking. There's a rule called the 180-degree rule in cinema, where you do not rotate the camera all the way because it tends to lose the audience as to where people are in the scene. He wanted to follow it like naturalistic dialogue, so he would have his camera follow whoever was talking, even if it meant going past the 180-degree rule. He's an amazing filmmaker. And those two guys basically led into the golden age of Japanese cinema. This was the most productive, creative period Japanese cinema had seen in forever. Sound was a big deal, budgets were huge. As soon as the occupation was over, it was off to the races. You could make a movie about anything you wanted to now. Which brings us back to Toho. And it's the early 1950s. Producer Tomoyuki Tanaka, who's one of the big producers of Toho at the time, was on his way to Indonesia to film a movie with a co-production about the fate of Indonesia after the war. But there was such massive anti-Japanese sentiment at the time in Indonesia from some of the people because, well, they'd been occupied by the Japanese not 10 years earlier, that the film was canceled and they had to go home. Around the same time, this happened. Whoops, where's my thing? This is the Castle Bravo nuclear test on Bikini Atoll in March of 1954. This was the first, well, not the first, but the largest bomb the United States ever set off. They didn't realize how big it was going to be. It was 3 times larger, the explosion, than they had planned on. So, a Japanese fishing vessel that thought it was in safe water was not.
Within seconds, the fun.
This boat was called the Lucky Dragon No. 5. They were outside of the blast radius, but they were not outside of the fallout zone. They saw what they thought was the sun rising in the west. And all of a sudden, this gray ash started falling all over their boat. They had no idea what it was. Some of them picked it up. Some of them actually tasted it. They couldn't figure out what it was. What it was radioactive pulverized coral falling from the sky. They returned to Japan. The boat was decontaminated. 3 weeks later, the radio operator died of radiation poisoning. The Japanese were outraged. They considered this to be the second bombing of Japan. They could not believe the Americans didn't tell them this was as big as it was going to be. Of course, the Americans didn't know it was going to be as big as it was going to be. Tomoyuki Tanaka based part of his idea for a new movie off of this event, and also on an American film. That film is The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms from 1953, which follows a really similar pattern. A prehistoric monster is awoken from the bottom of the ocean by atomic tests and goes on a rampage. However, this one goes on a rampage in New York City.
That makes sense geographically.
Well, in this case, it came from the Arctic. Somebody let a nuclear bomb go in the Arctic. And it was unfrozen from the ice. The special effects in that, by the way, are by a gentleman named Ray Harryhausen, who was probably the best at stop motion effects anyone has ever been. He was a genius. So, based on those two things, and The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms has been shown in Japan recently. It was a pretty big hit. People liked it. They decided they were going to make their own monster movie, but unlike The Beast, which really didn't have much allegory to it, in fact, in the end, the scientists and the military team up to defeat the monster using another nuclear device. Well, a nuclear device shot into the monster while it's destroying roller coaster on Coney Island. They were going to make their movie an explicit allegory for everything that had happened in Japan in the last 10 years. Production teams: Tomoyuki Tanaka was the producer, Ishiro Honda was the director, and he also co-wrote the screenplay. Takeo Murata was the other writer. Akira Ifukube composed the music and created Godzilla's iconic roar, and Eiji Tsuburaya, who had been brought back from his exile after the American occupation, was put in charge of special effects. I hate to use this term, considering what we're talking about, but this was ground zero for tokusatsu in Japan. Tokusatsu is a Japanese term which means special photographic effects. This is where it all starts. This production team and Eiji Tsuburaya. Now, this is going to seem like something really modern comparatively, but there was a lot of pre-release hype for this movie. There was a novelization released before the movie came out. There was a radio play based on an early treatment of the screenplay. Actually, I have heard parts of this radio drama, but I didn't understand any of it because it's all in Japanese. You know, it's hard to get subtitles on a radio. So anyway, what I'm going to show you next is the opening scene from the original Godzilla. Thank you. And just think about the Lucky Dragon number 5 when you see this opening scene. It's not exactly subtle. Of course, in this case, the boat sinks. Now, this movie is really heavy on the allegory and the symbolism and just kind of clubbing you over the head with, hey, this is bad. It's also the story of people. The 4 main characters are Dr. Kyohei Yamane, played by... yes, thank you. His daughter Emiko Yamane, Dr. Daisuke Serizawa, played by Akira Takarada, who's major in Toho films, and Hideo Ogata. Now, Emiko is engaged to Dr. Serizawa, but she's actually in love with basically the captain of a merchant vessel named Ogata. She can't tell her father that she's actually in love with this guy because he's the one who arranged the marriage. And there's sort of a modernity versus the past theme going with these characters. Dr. Yamane is a paleontologist, so his entire life is devoted to the past. Everything he does is all about the past. He's also the only major character in the film who grew up in the Taisho era as opposed to the Showa era. He grew up before the war. He grew up, in a more hopeful time. All the other characters have been affected by the war. In fact, Dr. Serizawa, he's missing an eye and has facial scars from his time in the war. He also has a really bitter attitude towards weapons and the ways politicians and the military misuse science to create weapons of destruction. He's also very reclusive, lives by himself, and almost lets no one in to see him except for his fiancée. Now, the monster itself went through many design ideas. Eiji Tsuburaya's studio, the name Gojira is actually a portmanteau of the Japanese word for gorilla, gorira, and whale, kujira. But never was there ever an idea to make it a whale or a gorilla. That's just the name they came up with. There's a apocryphal story that it's actually the nickname for a fat production assistant on the set who was really mean, but everyone says that's not true. They went with a dinosaur design because it would be easy to put a person in the suit to look like that. There were ideas floating around to make it an octopus. There were ideas floated around for various things. But they decided, so they originally wanted to go with the stop motion animation like Harryhausen used, but that was really time consuming and expensive, so they created a process that's become known as suitmation, where they create elaborate miniature sets and they put a man in a suit to destroy them. The sets in this case, Eiji Tsuburaya sent his production crew out, all of his special effects crew out. They mapped sections of Tokyo down to the as close as they could, and then recreated them in miniature. So every single scene of destruction is an actual place in Tokyo recreated at like 1/1000th scale, and then destroyed for the camera. They also did a lot of matte paintings that they did not digitally, they had to optically place them into the film. There's a scene later on in the movie where there's these rows and rows of electrical towers. None of those electrical towers were real. They were all put in there by painting and then cutting pieces of the film out and then projecting onto the screen with those paintings. This is from Godzilla's first attack on Tokyo, the next scene. Now this is another allusion to the wartime thing. There were actually more people killed in Tokyo during the firebombing of Tokyo than by the atomic bombs. So this was a reminder of how bad the firebombing had been. This is the scene that's here, that's coming up here. And all of those effects, those were all hand painted onto the frames of the movie. The next scene is one of the more grim scenes in the movie. This is from continuing on with Godzilla's rampage in Tokyo. And there's also, that right there is a hand puppet that they made of the head of the character. The suit itself weighed 150 pounds, so the actors could only wear it for a limited amount of time. And they said after wearing it for a day of filming, they would have to pull 2 to 3 cups of sweat out of the suit because it was so hot. This lady right here, what she tells her children is, "Soon we will be with Daddy." They actually, at one point, had to make multiple suits. One of them they had to cut in half and have the actor wear it like a pair of pants with suspenders for the scenes where Godzilla's just walking around and stomping on things. There's actually a picture of that later here. This scene is the aftermath of Godzilla's rampage. They wanted to capture what the devastation looked like after Hiroshima as close as they possibly could in miniature. And these are all the victims being taken to a triage center. That's one of the doctors scanning a child with a Geiger counter. Yeah, it's a real hopeful movie. Anyway, here's that scene from the production. Behind the scenes, this movie was apparently, aside from the guys wearing the suits, really fun to work on. And even the guys wearing the suits, when they got to do scenes like that, were having a pretty good time. I mean, they put shots like this behind the scenes stuff. They were having a good time on this movie, even though the movie was about some of the most serious stuff you can possibly imagine. Dr. Serizawa's story in the movie is really interesting. He was experimenting with oxygen, has created this device called the oxygen destroyer, which basically disintegrates things at a molecular level by removing all of the oxygen atoms from them. He doesn't want anyone to know this exists because he's convinced the government is going to use it as a weapon. And he only tells his fiancée about it, swears her to secrecy. She tells the guy she's in love with, though, when she realizes this might be the one chance they have of destroying Godzilla. Nothing else has worked. Nothing. They haven't been able to hurt him with bombs, planes, tanks. Nothing can stop this monster. So she's like, well, I've got to tell somebody because I know there's this weapon that can stop him. So they go to talk to Dr. Serizawa about it. That's when he pretty much figures out, oh, my girlfriend's cheating on me, and she revealed my greatest secret that I didn't want anyone to know. He kind of goes berserk and punches Ogata in the face and has this big fit about how do you not understand? I don't want my discovery to be found until I can figure out a peaceful use for it. I don't want anyone to have this horrible weapon that could be worse than what was unleashed upon us. It's basically once this genie is out of the bottle, we can't put it back in. It's not even a subtle metaphor for nuclear weapons. Eventually he's convinced to do it, but he burns all of his notes, and when they go to the bottom of the ocean to unleash the oxygen destroyer, he cuts his own oxygen line and kills himself so no one will ever know of this weapon. And that's how the movie ends. He basically tells his girlfriend, be happy with your new man. I was never good enough for you. So, it was a huge success. So they pumped out a quickie sequel the next year. This introduced the concept of Godzilla fighting another monster, and it was off to the races after that. 1955, Godzilla reigns again. 1962, King Kong versus Godzilla, which if you've never seen the Japanese version, is so much better than the American version. Although the rumor that there's a different ending isn't true. And then Mothra versus Godzilla in '64 was the last time Godzilla would actually be a villain. One of the interesting things is you can trace the evolution of Godzilla and how he changes to Japan's attitude towards nuclear weapons and nuclear power. As they switched more and more to using nuclear power as a fuel source, he becomes softer and more of a friend, more of a defender of the world. And the movies start becoming more and more aimed at children until we get this. Shortly thereafter, they tried to revamp the Godzilla series and make it more viable, but that didn't really work. And in '75, the series was shelved with the terror of Mechagodzilla. However, our old friend the Cold War decided to rear its head again, and Japan ended up basically being stuck between the rock of the Soviet Union and the hard place of the United States during the Cold War. So they decided in '84 it was time to bring Godzilla back. Because there's no better metaphor for nuclear tension and possible destruction than Godzilla. So they went back and basically pulled a Halloween 2018 and decided none of those movies that we made counted except for the first one. And that's where this movie came from. This is the return, Godzilla as it was called in Japan, or as known internationally, the return of Godzilla. This was a big budget film in Japan, and they really pushed for it to be released internationally. Unfortunately, unlike in the early days, when the Godzilla movies were actually pretty easy to market in the US, the first movie was released in '56 as Godzilla King of the Monsters with a bunch of scenes cut out that were really more grim, some of the more grim scenes cut out, and insert shots of Raymond Burr as a reporter named Steve Martin were inserted. So they were having a hard, and then, they basically became kids' fare. People would send their kids to the movies to go see these, and they were safe films to watch. So when this movie came out in '84, Toho was like, we're gonna sell this to America. We're gonna sell it to the United States. It's gonna be a big hit. They shopped it around to all the major studios, and nobody wanted to touch it. The only person who would touch it was Roger Corman. And if you know anything about movies, Roger Corman is the king of B-movie schlock. Although, really weird fact, James Cameron got his start as a production assistant for Roger Corman films. In fact, his directorial debut was Roger Corman's Piranha 2: The Spawning. He will not admit that. It's not on his it's on his IMDb page, but if you ask him about it, he's like, I didn't direct that. It's a terrible movie. Roger Corman decided, well, this movie was a hit when nobody takes Godzilla movies seriously, so we're going to make it a comedy when we bring it to the United States. This is a movie about nuclear devastation and Japan caught in Cold War tensions between Russia and the US, and he wanted to turn it into a comedy. They wanted to hire Raymond Burr back, but Raymond Burr was like, only if you take this movie seriously am I going to be in your movie. And so they changed it to be more serious, but not serious enough for him. They also had a major tie-in with Dr. Pepper. And it's obvious in the movie. I don't have any clips from Godzilla 1985, the American version. But if you ever get a chance to see it, there's Dr. Pepper in almost every American scene. There's a Dr. Pepper vending machine in the Pentagon. Walking in one of the hallways of the Pentagon, and they're walking away from it drinking Dr. Pepper with the label facing forward.
Not inaccurate.
It is.
Having worked in the Pentagon, not inaccurate.
It is a real. Also, they make some really bad jokes. There's that scene that I just showed you there where Godzilla's destroying the buildings. One of the American guys says, heck of an urban renewal program they got going over there. And I'm like, this is So the movie bombed in the US, of course. Funny enough, when I was a kid, this was the first Godzilla movie I rented on VHS. When it first came out on video in '85. I thought it was amazing. And I was so mad because every video store in the town I lived in at the time had it, but they only had it on beta. So the Godzilla series was back in Japan at least, and it was a major hit. Total success. They made more sequels until they got to '95 when they ended the series. Now I'm not using a lot of clips because Carson's filming this and Toho's like really super litigious about their movies being used on YouTube. If you ever get a chance to watch them, the movies made between '84 and '95 are really good. A personal favorite of mine is a movie called Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah from 1991. It is the most complicated plot you're ever going to find in a Godzilla movie. Let me explain this. A UFO shows up over Tokyo, and now, back in the day, that wouldn't have been a big deal because there were alien invasion plots all over in the 60s and 70s. And it seems like it was just a standard alien invasion plot. However, it turns out that this spaceship is from the 23rd century and it's full of humans who've come back in time to offer the Japanese a deal. We will go back to 1945, find the dinosaur that got nuked and turned into Godzilla, teleport it off the island, and you will never have had a Godzilla. So, they go back to an island in the middle of the war. This scene is one of the funniest things I've ever seen. There's Americans watching the time machine. It's this little time machine that comes out of the UFO and flying. And one of them goes, "What was that?" And I'm not even making up how the dialogue goes here. What was that? It looked like it was from another planet. Well, we shouldn't report it, but maybe you could tell your son about it when he's born, Major Spielberg. And this is from the Japanese version. This was not a dub. Here's one of the things. Whenever they wanted white people for a Godzilla movie, they hired Mormon missionaries because they were easy to find wandering around the streets. They didn't care if they had the acting chops. They would just pull them off and go, you speak English, you look like an American, as most of them were. He goes, here, do this. It was, and so the people from the past teleport Godzilla off the island, and they release these 3 adorable little creatures called doe-rats. They look like little golden puppy dogs with wings. They get nuked instead and turn it and merge into King Ghidorah, the 3-headed dragon. And now there's no Godzilla to stop him, and it turns out that the people from the future are actually terrorists who have come back in time to make sure that Japan does not dominate the world economically. Mind you, this was at the very tail end of the bubble economy in Japan. So Japan was kind of full of itself economically, and they're like, well, what could possibly stop us? Terrorists from the future! Unfortunately for them, mankind just can't leave good enough alone. Modern nukes create a new Godzilla who shows up, defeats King Ghidorah, and then attacks Japan because he's an ungrateful bastard. So, the people from the future go back to the future, find the body of King Ghidorah at the bottom of Tokyo Bay, turn it into a cyborg, go back to the past, and have a cyborg mecha King Ghidorah fight Godzilla. It is an amazing movie. I mean, it is not serious. It is nothing like the originals, but it is a gloriously ridiculous film. In '95, they ended the series, supposedly for the last time, but they killed off Godzilla. '99, they brought it back for Godzilla 2000, which was the first Godzilla movie released theatrically in the US in a first run since Godzilla 1985. I saw it 6 times in the theater. I was the only person in the theater for 3 of those showings. And of course we know that in '98 they tried to make an American Godzilla movie, but we don't talk about that.
You're lying.
Which, by the way, that character has been retroactively named Zilla in Japan because they took the god out of him. In fact, if you ever see a movie from 2004 called Godzilla Final Wars, there's a scene where Godzilla fights that thing in Sydney, Australia. The fight lasts 3 seconds. It's glorious. So Godzilla ended again in 2003. And it wouldn't be until 2016 2004. It would be until 2016 that there was a new Godzilla movie. And what precipitated a new Godzilla movie? The Fukushima nuclear disaster. The Japanese government's bad response to the tsunami and disaster of 2011 inspired Toho to go back to the drawing board again. And this time they hired a director by the name of Hideaki Anno. You might know him as the guy who invented Evangelion. So this is going to be a fun, hopeful movie. The result was Shin Godzilla, which if you have not yet seen it, is the best Godzilla movie made in like 40 years. It is amazing. I saw it in the theater twice, even though it was only showing 3 times in my town. It's an astoundingly good film. And it's also a political drama. It's about how inefficient the Japanese government is at actually dealing with a crisis. Most of the movie, when it's not showing Godzilla destroying stuff, is all set in different boardrooms and offices of the Japanese government. It's basically the West Wing versus Godzilla. And it's great. It takes a major catastrophe removing half of the government for anything to get done. It's a brilliant film. I mean, unfortunately I only have it on Blu-ray, so I couldn't rip any footage from it because I only have a DVD player on my computer. But it's a Gorgeous film. If you ever get a chance to see it, check it out. Now, after that, we've had the anime trilogy that just came out on Netflix. It's acceptable, but the thing, if you really want to see the anime trilogy, the thing you have to remember is who the head writer was. The head writer of the Godzilla anime trilogy is Gen Urobuchi, the guy who did Madoka Magica. So it's all about giving you, all about undermining expectations and twisting ideas. The Godzilla anime trilogy starts with monsters basically destroying the world. Humanity can't do anything about it, so they decide to leave the planet with the help of 2 alien races who've shown up to help them, to go find a new homeworld. They don't find one. So they decide, well, we'll go back to Earth and maybe try to take it back. Maybe. But because they've been using almost faster than light travel, 20,000 years has passed between when they left and when they came back, even though it's only been like 20 years for them. The whole planet is now covered in impenetrable razor-sharp plants, and the only living things are Godzilla and his descendants. They've got to figure out a way to stop him and take the planet back. It's really grim, and there is kind of a hopeful ending, but a lot of fans were not happy with it. And of course, this year we get another American Godzilla movie, which actually doesn't look bad. I'm kind of stunned by that fact. But anyway, the other major legacy of the Godzilla franchise is what it did to the Japanese pop culture landscape. Godzilla became so popular, everybody wanted in on this. So you had studios releasing movies like the Gamera trilogy, the Gamera films. Then you ended up with studios who've never done movies like this before, releasing horrible things like The X from Outer Space, Gappa the Trifibian Monster. It created what they called the first kaiju boom. Then Eiji Tsuburaya, genius that he was, decided that he was going to go and start making stuff for TV instead of working for Toho. So he started Tsuburaya Productions and brought giant monster action to the screen on a weekly basis with a TV series called Ultra Q, which led to the sequel series Ultraman, which has become one of the biggest franchises that still goes to this day. By the way, I am showing the new Ultraman series tomorrow night, the first 2 episodes. It is awesome. But everybody wanted in on this. It created the second kaiju boom on television, which is one of the reasons that the Godzilla movies' budgets started getting slashed. People weren't going to the movies anymore. They were staying home and watching this stuff on TV, because if you could get it weekly on television, why would you wait a year for another installment on the big screen? So around about the early 1970s, Toei decided they wanted in on this. So they created their own brand of superheroes. They weren't giants, they didn't fight giant kaiju. They were human-sized and fought human-sized monsters. The greatest of these was a show called Kamen Rider. Kamen Rider is still going to this day. And because of the success, and it was created by a man named Shotaro Ishinomori. Ishinomori holds the Guinness Book of World Records for the most prolific comic artist in history, with over 700,000 individual pages that he drew himself. He created Cyborg 009. He created Kamen Rider. He created, he created a little show in 1975 called Himitsu Sentai Go Ranger, which was the basis for the Super Sentai series, which sometime in the 90s got bought, chopped up, re-edited, and released as Power Rangers in the US. So basically, no Godzilla, no Power Rangers, because everything ties back in. The tokusatsu boom that started with Godzilla in '54 as this grim allegory for nuclear devastation through mutation and reiteration and copying and riffing on formula, ended up becoming a show about 5 teenagers with attitude fighting a space witch in California. And that Godzilla's still going, and he's still making movies. Toho actually has plans to, once the American series is done, Toho's got plans to start a new Godzilla series in Japan again. In fact, they want to create their own, well, and this isn't even a new idea for them. They want to create a shared universe of monster movies, which they'd already done in the 50s and 60s. All of their movies tied in with each other. If you've ever seen Destroy All Monsters, all the monsters they'd ever made are basically in that movie. So they didn't exactly invent the concept of the shared universe, or the expanded universe, or whatever you want to call it. Universal kind of beat them to that, like in the 30s with some of their monster movies. But Toho made it a big deal. And I guess my entire life has been changed by these movies, by the very existence of Godzilla. It was my favorite thing when I was a kid. I would get up every Sunday when the newspaper got there with the TV listings for the week in it. I'm a really old guy, okay? We had to wait. We had 5 channels when I was a kid. And we had to wait for the Saturday matinee movie to see maybe they had a Godzilla movie on. Then I got a VCR. And I rented Godzilla 85, and my mom bought me a copy of Godzilla vs. Megalon. Which, by the way, is, I'm not saying this casually, but Godzilla vs. Megalon is probably the queer-baitingest Godzilla movie ever made. 2 handsome Japanese bachelors living together in an apartment, in a house. No women anywhere in the entire movie. It's pretty suggestive, and people noticed, especially when they did the dub. It's a good movie in its own way for a 70s Godzilla movie, which is kind of like really faint praise. But it's fun, it's colorful, it has a giant cockroach, the Chrysler building for arms. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is Godzilla's a huge impact on my life. It got me started on the road to being a tokusatsu fan, which is kind of my life now. And I just wanted to share where it came from and how absolutely grim the original movie was, as far as and why they decided to make it. I hope you found something interesting in this. I kind of tend to go off on tangents when I'm talking about this stuff, so I didn't exactly stick to my script, but I hope you had a fun time. Thanks for coming.